I certainly don't think he really cares about being a pariah state. And so I think for him, that was almost a matter of kind of personal vindication to take out his sort of arch rival in this really peculiar way.
At this time every Monday, we take a look at the big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories. And joining me today, Sophia Gaston is a foreign policy expert and research fellow at the Centre for Statecraft and National Security at King's College in London. Sophia, good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for being with us. So look, the Munich Security Conference has just wrapped up with some strong messages about the future of the West. The US has talked about building a new world order, while Keir Starmer said Europe must become a sleeping giant and focus on hard power. Sophia, look, Marco Rubio made his speech, in which he said, am I right in thinking he basically said pretty similar stuff to J.D. Vance in his incendiary speech last year, but it wasn't quite as incendiary?
Well, there was actually quite a clear division of labor in their messages because there are two key things that the Trump administration wants from its closest European allies. The first is this kind of cultural proximity, which is what J.D. Vance was talking about last year. And the second thing is they want their allies to be capable and effective. And that's more what Rubio was focusing on this year. And I think it's interesting because actually, I think to European ears, we're much more comfortable receiving the second message. Certainly that first message, which comes from this kind of civilizational alliances doctrine that the Trump administration is very focused on, that, I think has rubbed Europeans up the wrong way. It can feel like interference in our social and political cultures. But this point about wanting us to be more capable and effective certainly fits much more naturally into conversations that we've been having ourselves. The problem is that the path to actually achieve that is actually extremely difficult. And so there is still a huge gap between the kind of rhetoric that the Europeans are projecting towards America, saying, yes, we're with you on this. Yes, we're spending more. And the reality of what's actually happening.
It's fascinating to divide it up like that. And the first half of that message, the kind of the cultural closeness one, I mean, without asking you to read minds, do the Americans mean it? Is that just something they say for their domestic base back home? Or are they genuinely worried that on a sort of cultural level, Europe is somehow drifting away from them?
They do genuinely believe that. I spent a lot of last year in the United States, interacting with the MAGA ecosystem, trying to understand a bit more about how they view alliances and what they want from us. And it's certainly genuine. And I think it's been something that has been challenging for senior European officials to adapt to, because they might be prepared to have a conversation about national security, but they also have to be able to have a conversation about, impressions that have reached across the pond about our kind of social and political cultures, whether that's around immigration or free speech and so on. So it has been a bit of a rough transition. I've been trying to sort of mediate and help both sides understand each other better, because I think there's been a lot of talking past each other. Certainly, some of the speeches that have been given by these senior Trump administration officials, Europeans have seen as the Americans sort of signaling that they want to divorce, quote unquote, divorce from Europe. But actually, the intention of these MAGA officials is they say that they're actually motivated to bring Europe closer. So I think amidst all of that, it's very clear you have to make a distinction between concerns about developments on issues that are actually pretty pertinent in our domestic politics. I mean, every European country is grappling with questions of immigration and integration and the net zero transition pace and some of the policing of language and so on. I think these are not taboos, but there is a distinction between some of the potential electoral interference. And I think it's really important for us to be very specific about those different messages and place different weight on them.
And on the military side of things, so Keir Starmer, he described Europe as a sleeping giant and said hard power is now the currency of the age. What's the vision here, and is there an agreed vision? Because I mean, people, NATO people used to resist the idea of a kind of sort of stronger combined European force on the basis that it would undermine NATO. Are we looking at sort of there being a kind of a coherent European army that is also part of NATO? Are there tensions there? What should we envisage?
Well, I think the most important thing is building a meaningful defense industrial marketplace in Europe. And at the moment, it's highly fragmented. And this is a thing I think that has been kind of swept under the rug a little bit, or perhaps the spotlight hasn't been on it. But for all the language that we've been talking about, Europe as if it's one kind of cohesive continental bloc, yes, there's a lot of allies there and like-minded partners, but we are also individual sovereign nations. And I think this is something that's actually been a bit of an inhibitor to progress in some of these areas. When we talk about defense industrial cooperation, there is still an incentive for national governments to carve out the best possible deal that supports their own industry. And so all these incentives that are driving us towards cooperation are also driving allied competition. And until we're really frank about that and bring that up into the surface, it's going to be very difficult for us to move forward. But the reality is, if you look at the US military machine, they have a national government there. Obviously, they've got states and all of that. It's more complicated, but they still do have one single national government that can drive production in the national interest. Here in Europe, we have very fragmented systems, and they're not all cohesively able to be sewn together so that we have one sort of like for like. And this is why it's been really difficult. We cannot actually, in the short term, replace a lot of the capabilities that we have traditionally relied on the United States for. And all these efforts for us to work more closely together as a kind of European autonomous market are constantly being stymied by national competition. So until we can really confront that, a lot of this still just remains bluster.
I mean, yeah, that explains why, despite being so much wealthier than Russia, but Europe is so much less confident about its own security, even than Russia seems to be. Look, but just before we move on from this, is there any sort of pullback in the United States that kind of pulls in the other direction? Is there any concern in the United States that, hang on, if this does happen, if Europe does stand on its own 2 feet with security, then the Europeans no longer need us, and that makes us less powerful?
This has always been a tension at the heart of NATO. The Americans have actually, really, for a very long time, been saying Europe needs to do more, Europe needs to stand on its own, Europe is wealthy, and that's all true. But at the same time, there have been moments where Europe has tried to kind of gain some more of that strategic control, and the United States has not wanted to relinquish that. And that's partly because the United States has always understood that Europe is regionally extremely important to its own security. And if you have a look, there's been much made of this sort of reprioritization of the US, this Western Hemisphere doctrine, which is why we've seen all this activity towards an interest in Greenland. That really gets up to the Arctic and the high north and the North Atlantic. So that's actually a NATO front line. So that's one of the reasons I never thought it was plausible that the United States would seek to withdraw from NATO. The question is, how does it withdraw some of its the capability functions that it provides while also maintaining that same level of strategic drive that it wants to retain over NATO priorities? And also, of course, secondarily, how does it ensure that its industry is not also disadvantaged by the Europeans pursuing the autonomy that Washington is telling us that they want us to achieve?
Yeah, so complicated, so fascinating. Let's talk a little bit directly about Russia and Ukraine, because obviously there was a lot of focus on that over the weekend. And we know that Russia and Ukraine are to meet for a new round of US brokered talks in Geneva. It's the constant question, but how real is this? I mean, how likely is this to lead anywhere? Zelensky said that Ukraine can only have an election in the event of a ceasefire. But is a ceasefire something that we should think about being even realistically on the cards?
It's still on the cards, but the really big point that underpins the viability of such a ceasefire is the depth and seriousness and reliability of the security guarantees that can be provided to Ukraine. And I think, what is clear is that the United States still has not spelt out what it's willing to offer and put on the table. I think if we pull back a little bit, there is a concern in Europe that we're going to lose a lot of strategic attention from the Americans on the question of a Ukrainian ceasefire. I think Trump really thought that he could come into office and get all this done very quickly. And he's really, it's gone beyond his realm of patience now. I think this protracted and complex nature. Some in his administration have had a victory in terms of being able to keep this issue live, not force the Ukrainians into something they can't accept. But it's also true that as we're now in the year of the US midterms, and of course China is going to be a huge focus for the president, it might be difficult to actually get those interventions from him and those concrete decisions for us to be able to take this forward. So the European assessment is that Russia is capable of fighting on for the rest of the year, is not in any stage of imminent collapse. And I suppose the judgment that we have to make is, would we rather this eke out for another year of tremendous suffering for the Ukrainian people, or have them bounced into a short-term decision that could be, have really, really profoundly negative long-term consequences?
Look, also on Russia, well, I've got you, Sophia. We learned yesterday that the Russian opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, was killed using a deadly toxin found in poison dart frogs in South America. Why does Russia do stuff like this? They had him in prison. He wasn't going anywhere. They could have, if and when he died, the suspicion was always going to fall on Russia. Why would they do this in such a weird and dramatic way?
Yeah, you do have to wonder about the psychology of someone who pursues such creativity and flourish in their barbarism. I don't think it was ever a prospect that Navalny was really going to be able to be released safely. I mean, there had been some hope that there could be a prisoner exchange down the track, but he's considered so personally threatening to President Putin that it was always, I think, unfortunately, probably more of a question of when, not if. I don't want to delve too much into the psychology of President Putin, who's obviously running a mafia state, but I think there's a degree of impunity here to his behavior. I think he feels that he is sort of well beyond shame, and I think the Russian state has been like that for quite some time. They're actually, I think, in a way, he might delight a little bit in the sort of bizarre specificity of the way in which they went about this. It does show a kind of sophistication, even in the most horrendous way. So I certainly don't think he really cares about being a pariah state. And so I think for him, that was almost a matter of kind of personal vindication to take out his sort of arch rival in this really peculiar way. But yeah, it's terrifying. And I think it's really important that Britain and our European allies came out and called that out. The question is, what levers are we actually going to use to hold President Putin to account for this? Because every single day we have, Russia's oil shadow fleet coming through our waters. We've just consistently shown ourselves unwilling and incapable of taking the kind of action that would actually punish President Putin.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. That's Sophia Gaston, who is a foreign policy expert and research fellow at the Centre for Statecraft and National Security at King's College London. Always good to speak to you.